Alright, so this is a very informal reading of, not informal reading, but this is a very informal setting where I haven't really set up my camera. But this is a reading of Ivanhoe, that's the correct pronunciation, right? By Sir Walter Scott. Okay, and since it is a difficult book for me, that is why I decided to read it and upload these videos on YouTube, and also because it was written in the Caroline age. I think it should be in the Caroline age. Yes, so it's like quite old, and that is why I think I can. That is why I think it's in public domain. I'll check it after the video. It should be in public domain though, but it will help me. I love narration. I love narrating stories, books, whatever I can read. I love that. So I have decided to do that for this 405 page book. Alright, here we go. Chapter 1. Thus commanded these, while to their lowly dome the full-fed swine returned with evening home, compelled, reluctant, to the several sties, with din obstreperous and ungrateful cries, Pope's Odyssey. In that pleasant district of merry England, which is watered by the river Don, there extended in ancient times a large forest, covering the greater part of the beautiful hills and valleys which lie between Sheffield and the pleasant town of Doncaster. The remains of this extensive wood are still to be seen at the noble seats of Wentworth, of Warncliffe Park, and around Rotherham. Here haunted of yore the fabulous dragon of Wantley. Here were fought many of the most desperate battles during the civil wars of the Roses, and here also flourished in ancient times those bands of gallant outlaws, whose deeds have been rendered so popular in English thought. Such being our chief scene, the date of our story refers to a period towards the end of the reign of Richard I, when his return from his long captivity had become an event rather wished than hoped for by his despairing subjects, who were in the meantime subjected to every species of subordinate oppression. The nobles, whose power had become exorbitant during the reign of Stephen, and whom the prudence of Henry II had scarce reduced to some degree of subjection to the crown, had now resumed their ancient license in its utmost extent, despising the feeble interference of the English Council of State, fortifying their castles, increasing the number of their dependents, reducing all around them to a state of vassalage, and striving by every means in their power to place themselves each at the head of each forces as might enable him to make a figure in the national convulsions which appeared to be impending. The situation of the inferior gentry, or the Franklins, as they were called, who by the law and the spirit of English constitution were entitled to hold themselves independent of feudal tyranny, became now unusually precarious. If, as was most generally the case, they placed themselves under the protection of any of the petty kings in their vicinity, accepted of feudal offices in his household, bound themselves by mutual treaties of alliance and protection him to support him in his enterprise, they might indeed purchase the temporary repose, but it must be with the sacrifice of that independence which was so dear to every English bosom, and at the certain hazard of being involved as a party in whatever rash expedition the ambition of their protector might lead him to undertake. On the other hand, such and so multiplied were the means of vexation and oppression possessed by the great barons, that they never wanted the pretext and seldom the will to harass and pursue even to the very edge of destruction any of their less powerful neighbors, who attempted to separate themselves from their authority and to trust for their protection, during the dangers of the times, to their own inoffensive conduct and to the laws of the land. Water break. Very important. A circumstance which greatly tended to enhance the tyranny of the nobility and the suffering of the inferior class, arose from the consequences of the conquest by Duke William of Normandy. 4 generations had not sufficed to blend the hostile blood of the Normans and Anglo-Saxons, or to unite by common language and mutual interest two hostile races, one of which still felt the elation of triumph, while the other ground under all the consequences of defeat. The power had been completely placed in the hands of Norman nobility by the event of the Battle of Hastings, and it had been used, as our histories show us, with no moderate hand. The whole race of Saxon princes and nobles had been extirpated or disinherited, with few or no exceptions, nor were the numbers great who possessed land in the country of their fathers, even as proprietors of the second or of yet inferior classes. The royal policy had long been to weaken by every means, legal or illegal, the strength of a part of the population which was justly considered as nourishing the most inveterate antipathy to their victor. All the monarchs of Norman race had shown the most marked predilection of the Norman subjects. The laws of the chase, and many other equally unknown to the milder and more free spirit of the Saxon constitution, had been fixed upon the necks of the subjugated inhabitants to add weight, as it were, to the feudal chains with which they were loaded. At court and in the castles of the great nobles, where the pomp and the state of a court was emulated, Norman French was the only language employed in courts of law. The pleadings and judgments were delivered in the same tongue. In short, French was the language of honor, of chivalry, and even of justice, while the far more manly and expressive Anglo-Saxon was abandoned to the use of rustics and hinds, who knew no other. Still, however, the necessary intercourse between the lords of the soil and the oppressed inferior beings by whom that soil was cultivated occasioned the gradual formation of a dialect, compounded betwixt the French and the Anglo-Saxon, in which they could render themselves mutually intelligible to each other, and from this necessity arose by degrees the structure of our present English language, in which the speech of victors and the vanquished have been so happily blended together, and which has since been so richly improved by importations from classical languages and from those spoken by the southern nations of Europe. They experienced so much and yet subjugated like half of the world to the same thing that their ancestors had experienced. Does this cycle continue of the victim being the oppressor over and over again? Like how we're witnessing that in um, in Palestine, right? And I mean, look at them talking about all of this with such um, feeling while while colonizing half of the world and treating the native people of those lands with such as much, what did he say, those oppressed inferior beings by whom that soil was cultivated occasioned the gradual formation of a dialect. Now that is a different thing, but that is the same thing that the English people did to India, to other countries. So it's just quite funny how I am an English literature student. I have to read these things. I enjoy reading them too at times when I do not see a very clear indication of how these people are just enjoying colonizing my countries and my country and my ancestors. That is just very hypocritical. But what do you expect? What do you expect? Anyways, let's continue. This state of things I have thought it necessary to premise for the formation of the general reader, who might be apt to forget that although two great historical events such as war or insurrection mark the existence of Anglo-Saxons as a separate people subsequent to the reign of William II, yet the great national distinctions betwixt them and their conquerors, the recollection of what they had formerly been, and to what they were now reduced, continued down to the reign of Edward III, to keep open the wounds which the conquest had inflicted, and to maintain a line of separation betwixt the descendants of the victor Normans and the vanquished Saxons. The sun was setting upon one of the rich grassy glades of that forest, which we have mentioned in the beginning of the chapter. Hundreds of broad-headed, short-stemmed, wide-branched oaks, which had witnessed perhaps the stately march of the Roman soldiery, flung their gnarled arms over thick carpet of the most delicious green sward. In some places they were intermingled with beeches, hollies, and copsewood of various descriptions, so closely as totally to intercept the levels of beams of the sinking sun. In others, they receded from each other, forming those long sweeping vistas in the intricacy of which the eye delights to lose itself, while imagination considers them as the paths to yet wilder scenes of sylvan solitude. Here the red rays of the sun shot a broken and discolored light that partially hung upon the shattered boughs and mossy trunks of the trees, and they illuminated in brilliant patches the portions of turf through which they made their way. A considerable open space in the midst of this glade seemed formerly to have been dedicated to the rites of the Druidical superstition, for on the summit of a hillock, so regular as to seem artificial, there still remained part of a circle of rough, unhuman stones of large dimensions. 7 stood upright, and the rest had been dislodged from their places, probably by the zeal of some convert to Christianity, and lay some prostrate near their former side, and others on the side of the hill. One large stone only had found its way to the bottom, and in stopping the course of a small brook which glided smoothly round the foot of the eminence, gave by its opposition a feeble voice of murmur to the placid and elsewhere silent streamlet. The human figures which completed this landscape were in number too, partaking in the dress and appearance of that wild and rusty character which belonged to the woodlands of the West Riding of Yorkshire at that early period. The eldest of these men had a stern, savage, and wild aspect. His garment was of the simplest form imaginable, being a close jacket with sleeves composed of the tanned skin of some animal, on which the hair had been originally left, but which had been worn off in so many places that it would have been difficult to distinguish from the patches that remained to what creature the fur had belonged. This primeval vestment reached from the throat to the knees, served at once all the usual purposes of body clothing. There was no wider opening at the collar than was necessary to admit the passage of the head, from which it may be inferred that it was put on by slipping it over the head and shoulders in a manner of a modern shirt or ancient hauberk. Sandals bound with thongs made of boar's hide protected the feet. A roll of thin leather was twined artificially around the legs, and ascending above the calf, left the knees bare, like those of a Scottish Highlander. To make the jacket sit yet more close to the body, it was gathered at the middle by a broad leathern belt, secured by a brass buckle, to one side of which was attached a sort of scrip, and to the other a ram horn, accoutred with a mouthpiece, for the purpose of blowing. In the same belt was stuck one of those long, broad, sharp-pointed, and two-edged knives, with a buck's horn handle, which were fabricated in the neighbourhood, and bore even at this early period the name of the Sheffield whittle. The man had no covering upon his head, which was only defended by his own thick hair, matted and twisted together, and scorched by the influence of the sun into a rusty red colour, forming a contrast with the overgrown beard upon his cheeks, which was rather of a yellow amber hue. One part of his dress only remains, but it is too remarkable to be suppressed. It was a brass ring, resembling a dog's collar, but without an opening, and soldered fast round his neck, so loose as to form no impediment to his breathing, yet so tight as to be incapable of being removed, excepting by the use of the file. On this singular gorget was engraved in Saxon characters an inscription of the following purport: Gerd, the son of Beowulf, is the born thrall of Cedric of Rotherwood. Beside the swineherd, for such was Kurt's occupation, was seated upon one of the fallen Judical monuments, a person about 10 years younger in appearance, and whose dress, though resembling his companions in form, was of better materials and of more fantastic appearance. His jacket had been stained of a bright purple hue, upon which there had been some attempt to paint grotesque ornaments in different colours. To the jacket he added a short cloak, which scarcely reached halfway down his thigh. It was of crimson cloth, though a good deal soiled, lined with bright yellow, and as he could transfer it from one shoulder to the other, or at his pleasure draw it all around him, with its width contrasted with its want of longitude, formed a fantastic piece of drapery. He had thin silver bracelets upon his arm, and on his neck a collar of the same metal bearing the inscription, Vamba, the son of Witless, is the thrall of Cedric of Rotherwood. This personage had the same sort of sandals with his companion, that instead of the roll of leather thong his legs were cased in a sort of gaiters, of which one was red and the other was yellow. He was provided also with a cap having around it more than one bell, about the size of those attached to hawks, which jingled as he turned his head to one side or other, and as he seldom remained a minute in the same posture, the sound might be considered as incessant. Around the edge of this cap was a stiff bantu of leather, cut at the top into openwork resembling a coronet, while a prolonged bag arose from within it, and fell down on one shoulder like an old-fashioned nightcap or a jelly bag, or the headgear of a modern hussar. It was to this part of the cap that the bells were attached, which circumstance, as well as the shape of his headdress and his own half-praised, half-cunning expression of countenance, sufficiently pointed him out as belonging to the race of domestic clowns or jesters, maintained in the houses of wealthy to help away the tedium of those lingering hours which they were obliged to spend within doors. He bore, like his companion, a scribe attached to his belt, but had neither horn nor knife, being probably considered as belonging to a class whom it is esteemed dangerous to entrust with edged tools. In the place of these he had equipped with a sword of lath, resembling that with which Harlequin operates his wonders upon the modern stage. The outward appearance of these two men formed scarce a stronger contrast than their look and demeanour. That of the serf or bondsman was sad and sullen. His aspect was bent on the ground with an appearance of deep dejection, which might be at most constructed into apathy, had not the fire which occasionally sparkled in his red eye manifested that there slumbered under the appearance of sullen despondency a sense of oppression and a disposition to resistance. The looks of Mamba, on the other hand, indicated, as usual with his class, a sort of vacant curiosity and fidgety impatience of any posture of repose, together with the utmost self-satisfaction respecting his own situation and the appearance which he made. The dialogue which they maintained between them was carried on in Anglo-Saxon, which, as we said before, was universally spoken by the inferior classes, excepting the Norman soldiers and the immediate personal dependents of the great feudal lords. But to give their conversation in original would convey but little information to modern reader, for whose benefit we beg to offer the following translation. The curse of Saint Withold upon these infernal hawkers, said the swineherd after blowing his horn obstreperously. I'm sorry, but I'm not, I guess. Anyways, let's try again. Obstreperously, to collect together the scattered head of swine, which, answering his call with notes equally melodious, made, however, no haste to remove themselves from the luxurious banquet of beech-mast or acorns on which they had fattened, or to forsake the marshy banks of the rivulet, which several of them had plumbed in mud, lay stretched at their ease, altogether regardless of the voice of their keeper. The curse of Saint Withold upon them and upon me, said Gruff. If the two-legged wolf snap up some of them at nightfall, I am no true man. Here, thanks, He ejaculated at the top of his voice to a ragged, wolfish-looking dog, a sort of lurcher, half mastiff, half greyhound, which ran limping about as if with the purpose of seconding his master and collecting the refractory grunters, but which, in fact, from misapprehension of the swineherd's signal, ignorance of his own duty or malice prepense, only drove them hither and thither, and increased the evil which he seemed to design to remedy. A devil draw the teeth of him, said Gruff, and the mother of mischief confound the ranger of the forest, that cuts the foreclaws of our dogs, and makes them unfit for the trade. Wamba, up and help me, and thou best of men, beest of men, take a turn around the back of the hill, to gain the wind on them, and when thou got the weather cage, thou mayst drive them before thee as gently as so many innocent lambs. I must say this, that I cannot speak in that. I do not know what kind of accent they're supposed to have, whatever the kind of accent that is. I think in the modern English it could be compared with Cockney accent. Well, that is famously not, like, it's famously difficult, but it is also quite common, isn't not, in England? So yeah, it's quite difficult to read it in words. I mean, to understand it is difficult, but to read it is also quite difficult. Anyways, let us continue. Truly, said Wamba, without stirring from the spot, I have consulted my legs upon this matter, and they are altogether of opinion that to carry my gay garments through those sloughs would be an act of unfriendship to my sovereign person and my royal wardrobe. Therefore, Gurth, I advise thee to call of thanks and leave the herd to their destiny, which, whether they meet with the bands of travelling soldiers or of outlaws or of wandering pilgrims, can be little less than to be converted into Normans before morning, to thy no small ease and comfort. The swine turn Normans to my comfort? Quoth Gurth. Expound that to me, Wamba, for my brain is too dull and my mind too vexed to read riddles. Why, how call you those grunting brutes running about on their 4 legs? Demanded Wamba. Swine, fool, swine, said the herd. Every fool knows that. And swine is good Saxon, said the jester. But how call you the sow when she is flayed and drawn and quartered and hung up by the heels like a traitor? Pork, answered the swineherd. I am very glad every fool knows that too, said Wamba, and pork, I think, is good Norman French. And so when the brute lives and is in the charge of a Saxon slave, she goes by her Saxon name, but becomes a Norman and is called pork. When she is carried to the castle hall to feast among the nobles, what dost thou think of this, friend Gurth, huh? It is but too true doctrine, friend Wamba. However, it got into thy fool's pate. Nay, I can tell you more, said Wamba in the same tone. There is an alderman ox continues to hold his Saxon epithet, while he is under the charge of serfs. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. While he is under the charge of serfs and bondsmen such as thou, but becomes beef, a fiery French callant, when he arrives before the worshipful jaws that are destined to consume him. Minhir Calf, too, becomes Monsieur de Foucault in the like manner. He is Saxon when he requires tendance, and takes a Norman name when he becomes a matter of enjoyment. Well, reminds you of colonization. Ha 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 ha. It feels like I'm betraying my country whenever I'm reading English literature and enjoying it. Whenever I'm enjoying English literature. But is that supposed to be? Because I'm still having a lot of feelings about that. And maybe it's going to take me a few years to really come to a conclusion. By St. Dunstan, answered Gurth, thou speakest but sad truth. Little is left to us but the air we breathe, and that appears to have been reserved with much hesitation, solely for the purpose of enabling us to endure the task they lay upon our soldiers. They thought of this, but they could not think of what they were doing to our countries and our people. The finest and the fattest is for their board, the loveliest is for their couch, and the best and the bravest supply their foreign masters with soldiers and witten distant lands with their bones, leaving few here who have either will or the power to protect the unfortunate Saxon. God's blessing on a master Cedric. He had done the work of a man and standing in the gap, but Reginald Front de Boeuf is coming down to this country in person, and we shall soon see how little Cedric's trouble will avail him. Herr explained again, raising his voice, so ho, well done, thanks. Thou hast them all before thee now, and brings them on bravely, lad. As I said before, does every victim has the fate of becoming the perpetrator? That would mean that my country would also become the perpetrator soon. Maybe I am a part of the perpetrators. Maybe I am. I heard somewhere, maybe it was on the internet or was it in the newspaper? It's the same thing nowadays. You do not hear about the news in the newspaper exactly. You hear it everywhere else, actually. So I heard that I think data centers were being made on the land of Dalits and of indigenous people. And basically, I remember reading about this article that um, the land of the indigenous people at various places in India, the indigenous tribes, are being taken away. That basically means that they're taking away their identity, because their identity is directly attached to their land. That is their whole life, their whole legacy, everything. And they're taking it away. And just this part here. Okay. I should be underlining these. Okay, I underlined this part because that's one line that I felt was really good. And this part, this is like everything is just so good here. This part. And here he mentions the finest and the fattest is for their board, the loveliest is for their couch. The best and the bravest supply their foreign masters with soldiers and whitened distant lands with their bones. Let us see if I can find it. But the dichotomy that the greatest, someone has done something great, something that we call great, or something that we call really good, really important, someone that we admire. So many times our heroes actually end up being the people that we end up being so disappointed in. Now, Sir Walter Scott wasn't my hero at all, but the thing is, you hear these things as a person who has understood their land's colonial history, right? And you read these lines and you're like, oh my god, you're so right. And then you question why would you not understand the same thing? Just because it's, I don't know, we look different, it's a different land, we speak different languages, we have different culture, so many things. Oh my god, that's another whole thing. Let us continue. Gerd, said the jester, I know thou thinkest me a fool, or thou wouldst not be so rash in putting thy head into my mouth. One word to Reginald Front de Boeuf, or Philippe de Melvoisin, that thou hast spoken treason against the Norman, and thou art but a castaway swineherd, thou wouldst waver On one of these trees is a terror to all evil speakers against dignities. Dog, the woods not betray me, said Gurth, after having led me on to speak so much at disadvantage. Betray thee? Said Chester. No, that were the trick of a wise man. A fool cannot half so well help himself, but soft. Whom have we here? He said, listening to the trampling of several horses which became then audible. Never mind whom, answered Gurth, who had now got his herd before him, and with the aid of Fangs was driving them down one of the long dim vistas, which we have endeavoured to describe. Nay, but I must see the riders, answered Wamba. Perhaps they are to come from Fairyland with a message from King Oberon. How old is this story? It's supposed to be set in Saxon times, but the only place where I have heard the King Oberon's mention is in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Oberon and Titania, right? Right? The fairies, but yeah, Shakespeare is famous for taking inspiration for his stories, so what could it be? I would love to read Shakespeare, yes, but I cannot read it as uh, gracefully as, of course, theatre artists do. But I would love to read Shakespeare. That would be so cool. A murrain take thee, rejoined the swineherd. Wilt thou talk of such things while a terrible storm of thunder and lightning is raging within a few miles of us? Hark, how the thunder rumbles, and for summer rain I never saw such broad downright flood drops fall out of the clouds. The oaks too, notwithstanding the calm weather, sob and creak with their great boughs as if announcing a tempest. Thou canst play the rational if thou wilt. Credit me for once, and let us home ere the storm begins to rage, for the night will be fearful. Wamba seemed to feel the force of this appeal, and accompanied his companion, who began his journey after catching up a long quarter staff which lay upon the grass beside him. The second, Eumaeus, strode hastily down the forest glade, driving before him with the assistance of Fangs, the whole herd of his inharmonious charge. Interesting, we're done with the chapter 1. I'm hoping to read this a bit more quickly, but let us see. Oh my god, I look like an egg. But anyways, cute egg. Yeah, bye.